Sue, I think I'll hand to you. All good?
Great,
To
thanks
go?
Don.
Thank you.
Thanks, and as Don said, I now moved from being the Special Rep for Australian Agriculture to a LiveCorp Board Director for this particular session. And I'll move from really those broader international perspectives to really very specific views and thoughts around the live export sector. And, as you know, and as I mentioned, we're experiencing high prices, downturn in economic conditions. We've really got to send our message in terms of the value proposition and what the live export sector can provide. So we've got a great panel here today. They're going to provide some insights into those factors around customer expectations, requirements, culture, nutrition, and where the opportunities lie. And they're going to give us some thoughts on how we can actually market the live export sector. So on our panel today, Neny, wonderful to see you. Neny's from Indonesia and she's a vet, and she's also the Animal Welfare and Health Manager for PTJAA in Indonesia. Neny is also the chair of the Indonesian Forum for Animal Welfare Officers, so welcome Neny. And Neny's also been involved in animal handling programs and welfare in SCAS facilities. We've also got Rod Dyer. Rod is a director of FocusGroupGo Asia Pacific, which is a small Vietnam-based research project management and consulting firm that specialises in the agribusiness and agri-food sectors throughout the Asia Pacific. And Rod was previously the Agribusiness Research Program Manager for ACR, of which I'm a commissioner, and Project Manager for North Australia Beef Program with MLA. Rod also has a PhD in Ag Economics and undergraduate master's degrees in Animal Science and Rangeland Management. And from the Middle East, we have Dr. Faris, who's a vet from the Saudi company Amiral. Amiral is a private company in Saudi which has built and operates a modern slaughterhouse and abattoir inside of Mecca in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Dr. Faris is visiting Australia to learn more about the supply chains for sheep. And also from MENA is Amanda Hodges, who is MLA's Trade and Market Access Manager and the in-market livestock export program representative based in Dubai, UAE. And Amanda has a background in international trade, government and international relations, leading business development teams in Middle East, India and Asia. So now you know our panel, and I'm actually going to let them do all of the talking and just maybe probe every now and then. But let's start with a discussion around the high livestock prices and increasing food prices. And Neny, in Indonesia, given it's our biggest live export market for cattle, what's happening in terms of livestock and the requirements that you're seeing for meat in Indonesia and how that's changed?
Thank you, Sue. Indonesia is a strong economic country. I think it ranks number 7 in the world in terms of GDP. So it's a strong country, good economic and high population. I think it is 265 million population. But for now, we experience the same problem. Red meat price is high, but the demand is decline. The decline demands caused by the increase of living costs, including the food costs. And then you know that we are still suffer from the COVID-19 impact. So people like more conservative in spending. But for Australian livestock, it is become more severe, the decline more down and down because some of the portion of the market now are substituted by the Indian buffalo meat. So for those who doesn't have a picture about Indonesia, you can picture if here people eat steak, we have bakso meatball. It is very popular food in Indonesia. So 70% of meat production from cattle goes to the bakso producer previously. But now, because of the price is high and we have Indian buffalo meat coming, the bakso producer now learn how to make the bakso meatball from the IBM. So I think it's a serious condition. I think it will increase the capture of the market of Australian livestock, and I think we should work together how to prevent it happen and become a permanent loss of the market of Australian livestock. That's, I think, the condition in Indonesia today. Yeah.
Thanks, Neny. And I mean, that's certainly, I hadn't heard about the penetration of Indian buffalo meat into Indonesia, and my understanding is it's just growing, and the further distance you're getting from the cities, the more you're seeing it. So it is a bit of a concern. Rod, what's happening in Vietnam in terms of prices? I mean, I was there recently, and you know, compared to when I left Australia, I think lettuces had hit a frightful amount. They were certainly a lot less when I got to Vietnam, but...
Yeah. No, thanks, Sue, and thank you, LiveCorp, for the invitation to join the panel. Yeah, it's clear, you know, since 2019, you know, live export prices have increased a lot, and to the point where the margins that existed between the Australian and Vietnam price before 2019, those margins have diminished and in some cases are negative. And so importers and feedlotters are struggling with, you know, profitability and the ability to turn those cattle over. So as a result, you know, the import trade of Australian cattle is under extreme pressure. But when you look at the economy as a whole, it's an interesting dynamic with many competing factors. 90% of meat is consumed in traditional wet markets and is important as part of, you know, food security for Vietnam. And the interesting thing is that Vietnam has weathered COVID quite well. They have a strong economic recovery. So from the demand side, they expect GDP growth of 7% and 6% next year. A young population that will just turn over 100 million people expected next year, with a median age of around 32 years. And consumers are eating more meat, they're eating more beef, they're eating higher value meat, they're eating out more. So the fundamentals of the consumer and the consumption market are very strong. So it's interesting that we haven't seen an increase in prices with the increased price of Australian beef in Vietnam. And I think what's happening is the global or the regional impacts of beef markets and trade are buffering what's happening in Vietnam. So at the same time, Australian live cattle prices are very high. The informal trade of cattle through the Mekong regions, Thailand, Myanmar, to China has stopped because of China's crackdown of cross-border trade. So at the same time, cattle from Thailand and Myanmar and other cattle in the region are now filling the gap in the Vietnamese market. So whilst Australian cattle, the demand for Australian cattle at the market at the moment is quite weak, and animals are in the feedlot for some time, that gap in supply is being sourced from other countries in the region. And that provides, it provides two things. One is the dynamics of trade and markets is very important, and things happen quickly and change quickly. But it also is for the Australian producer in the Australian market, we have to be aware that Vietnam relies on imports up to over 50% for food security, and they need to find other sources of affordable protein and beef. And so they can't wait forever. So remaining engaged with the sector is really important.
Thanks. And what about the value that those, you know, the live exports provide in Vietnam? Come to you. Oh, sorry. Is my microphone on? So, Rod, what about the value that the live export market provides and the industry provides in Vietnam?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as I said, Australian live cattle before 2020 contribute around at least 20% of total beef consumption. And as I mentioned, Vietnam relies very heavily on imports of cattle and beef for its total beef consumption, up to 70%. So food security is a major issue. So in terms of value, feeding the population is really important. Beef is a minor part of meat consumption compared to pork. However, it's very important. And as we know, there's many famous beef dishes in Vietnam. And the government recognises that they need to diversify away from pork consumption and strengthen beef production and consumption because of that. So at the same time, you have very high increase in demand, but the inability to afford supply is the thing. So apart from the value of food security, it's important economically to the feedlot industry, to the supporting industries around it, which are also important. But food security is tremendously important in Vietnam, and the importance of Australia as a food and beef producer, supplier to Vietnam, can't be understated.
Thanks, Rod. And what about in MENA, in the MENA regions? How are you seeing that in terms of the prices and food security and the impacts there?
Yes, Saudi Arabia's livestock, especially in the sheep, you know, it's the prices will be go up, follow the international price, you know, you know, we have season for Muslim, as this is Hajj season, you know, and Ramadan. The prices go up with this season special, but still the prices together go with the international life market, yeah.
And what impact do cultural issues have on the market? Yes.
Yeah. The culture now is people, they eat Dyer sheep more than cattle, you know. This is biggest. We have per year 550 billion ton per year the consumption there uses. It's 75% of this one is sheep, you know. The balance is cattle and some camels. Yeah, that's all.
Yep. Amanda, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. You mentioned food security, and it's absolutely top of mind in the Middle East. I think the population is over 450 million when you gather up all of the Middle East region. And it's very, as we've heard on previous panels and previous presentations, heavily reliant. Up to 90% of food is imported. But there's also these peak periods of import around the religious festivals, Hajj and Eid in particular. And the domestic livestock isn't able to supply that market, so it's very reliant on imports. And I guess in the past, Australia has been and continues to be a very important trading partner and has been for over 50 years. So, yeah, food security is top of mind. The other really important thing I think going on in the Middle East is a real elevation and attention to food safety. So there's been enormous investment in new slaughterhouses, abattoirs, to be able to better process livestock more efficiently with greater hygiene standards. And that's where Dr. Faris's company and Mr. Bader, who's travelling here from Saudi, have invested in a big slaughterhouse to really elevate the food safety.
Yes, the slaughterhouse now, it's the biggest one in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, especially is per 1 hour. The phase 1 is 1,100. Now we have second phase is totally coming 3,100 per hour. Maybe one day we have 24,000 heads per day. Specialty in Hajj, we will slaughtering at least in our facilities, our abattoir is maybe 200 to 300,000 heads, just only for 84 hours. You know, the Hajj season is special, it's just only limit time.
Yeah, and Neny, picking up on that cultural issue, you know, and the festivals, and I just wonder if you could talk a bit more to us about that and the implications.
The value of the market. Yeah, I think Australian livestock contribute in Indonesian culture. As you know, Indonesia is the largest Muslim population country in the world, and if it comes to Kurban festival, it cannot be replaced by frozen meat or chilled meat. It has to be livestock. So I think Australian livestock gives an addition to as a variety of choice to the local farm, to the local cattle, so the supply can be filled easily. But I want to add also, Sue, it is not only a culture or a religion issue, but it is also a food safety and security. When Rod said that Vietnam depend like 50 or 70% from import. I think I can a bit proud because Indonesia can cover 2/3 of the needs. So we depend on import 1/3 of the needs. And I think Australian livestock will contribute in there. So yeah, another value is the economic and community well-being. I came from Juang Jaya Abdi Alam. It's a feedlot operation. Our feedlot hold support like 12,000 households. And if it nationally, this industry provide 100,000 jobs. You can imagine 100,000 jobs. So it's really gives economic value to Indonesia. Not to mention that in the process of this industry, it is a transfer knowledge also to the local farmers to increase their ability from conventional management to a more modern management, so they can manage more cattle in their backyard. And that's provide additional income and their confidence to support their children to the higher education. So it's really huge impact of value. Yeah.
So, Neny, while you've got the microphone, you've had a really great career in terms of animal welfare, and I had talked about some of the challenges that I've seen in how other countries view Australia's animal welfare practices. What do you see the view from Indonesia, given we've got such a strong live export market there, and how do you see animal welfare practices changing?
That's really a question for me. So I see we see that the practice of animal welfare it's been applied and increased years to years. It's been there for more than 10 years. So people become really knowledgeable, become very good in skills, and for now they understand that doing their job with animal welfare practice means they work easier and faster, and it is a safety way to do the job. So it is benefit them also. Yeah. And in Indonesia now we have a forum animal welfare officer that gather all the animal welfare officer across the section, whether he works for exporters, importers, feedlotters, abattoirs. We come together to collaborate and we provide trainings, work together to improve the knowledge and the skills, and we have LEP, MLA to support us to do the trainings, and we are now lucky because Indonesia-Australian red meat cattle partnership also support us to do our 2 years development and training program. So it's been really different from the way we start the SCAS. So I am really confident that it is a really good practice. But we also need to consider animal welfare with that lots of administrative requirement is costly. So for now, for the sustainable of the business, we need to think how about doing the animal welfare but with more reasonable cost. Yep. I think we do sharing performance audits for like 2 years. I think this has to be kept doing, and we need to explore another way to make the cost of animal welfare is reduced. Thank you, Sue.
I think everyone here would share that same view. Rod, Vietnam, tell us about animal welfare and how that's changing in Vietnam.
Sure. Regarding animal welfare, I'd like to acknowledge first up the delegation from the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Vietnam, as well as Michael Patching. They've been involved right at the coalface of the implementation of animal welfare standards, the development of those standards, and the recent release of them, as well as the training and capability development that's gone on. But what I see in Vietnam from an observer is that the presence of Australia in the market and the requirements that has, particularly around SCAS and animal welfare, has driven significant change. And the development and endorsement of animal welfare standards by the government of Vietnam that apply not only to Australian cattle but all livestock is an example of that change. And so it's the support of the government and the industry, MLA, and the Live Export program working with the Vietnam Ministry of Agriculture has been really, really important. And so it is important. The government of Vietnam sees animal welfare as a key part of the livestock modernisation strategy and modernising their livestock sector. They know that they have to add value, improve processing, improve productivity, but also improve food safety and animal welfare. And so Australia has had a key role in supporting that. And of course, implementation is always challenging, but there is evidence around stunning, widespread adoption of stunning, the approval of stunning manufacturer and use of stunning devices in Vietnam are all really big steps in that process. So from an external point of view, I see that the importance of the engagement with that sector and why being part of that is being improving animal welfare more generally outside the Australian supply chain.
Thanks, Rod. And Dr. Farris, I understand in Saudi that the animal welfare laws have really,
Yes,
been introduced now.
For the welfare is very important for all blockchain, in Saudi Arabia, and also now everything has changed now in Saudi Arabia, especially rules from Ministry of Water and Environment and Agriculture. They push all private sector to change the rules and also follow the rules which one they put it. And also already now we are ready to SCAS for our facilities in our company, and we will make for import from Australia for sheep, and then we accepted SCAS.
And Amanda, in the region more broadly?
Yeah, I think definitely in the Middle East, operators look to Australia and we're regarded as highly regulated somewhat, but obviously for the benefit of animal welfare, and they recognise that good welfare is good for their animal welfare is good for their business, and they're wanting to learn from us. But I think with the recent government announcement around sheep, they kind of are questioning why they have committed and invested so heavily in really good practices for transport, for handling of animals in country, to then have this potentially ban looming over them. So I think that's created a bit of confusion in the market. Definitely, the perception there is, have we done something wrong? And when in fact they've actually complied and really, done their best and continue to commit to very high standards of animal welfare. So yeah, it's an interesting space at the moment in terms of responding to that.
So Amanda, that was an issue that was raised in the panel this morning, and we've heard it come up in a number of presentations today, and I'm sure it'll come up again tomorrow. How do you see, what's the feeling in country around what they're hearing here about potentially what may happen in terms of the sheep trade?
Well, I think for those who have been trading with Australia for a very long time, as I said, it's confusing for them because they feel they've complied with SCAS, they've reduced the supply chain, restricted it, and for those new operators coming in, they're questioning the longevity and the sustainability. Is it going to be there? Is Australia going to be a trusted trading partner, as it's been for many, many years? Will that continue? And I think there's questioning around that. But it's also a bit of an affront. There's, I think, some assumption that live animals can be replaced with boxed meat and boxed protein, and that is absolutely not the case. And as you've heard from Dr. Farris, culturally and religiously, and from a family perspective, meat is and livestock is a very important part of the culture, and it can't be replaced with Australia supplying boxed meat essentially. So, yeah, it is a bit of a vexed issue at the moment.
Yeah, that of course then takes us to our markets in Indonesia and Vietnam. Are you sensing anything in those markets, in your markets, about any concerns about what you may be hearing about our live sheep trade and the consequences that could be for the cattle, particularly given we had that earlier conversation this morning on the panel around the lessons learned from 2011.
You mean that if the livestock close? Also, that's really sad, I think. When we talk about Australian livestock in Indonesia, we not only talk about the trade, it's the people. I already mentioned 100,000 jobs. Can you imagine what happened if the livestock stop and then the people will lose the job? It will be really not human if we become responsible for them losing their job. So it's not really good. Not to mention as globally, it means that Australia is not contributing for food safety and security. I think it's really a bad condition. But in other side, Indonesia will find a way, will find another source that more reasonable. And I think has to be a thought for Australia, that because if Indonesia find how to fill the gap, and like people now learn how to make Indian buffalo meat become a taste and a better taste and texture for their meal, I think it become a permanent loss for the market of Australian livestock. So it's a work both way, from Indonesia and for Australia also. Yeah.
And Rod, Vietnam, what's the thinking there, or what are you hearing?
Yeah, I don't think that news has filtered through. I just have to say, though, just the raising of that issue is a risk in the current market environment where things are difficult. And if there's something to learn, as we heard this morning from the Indonesian experience, is the long-term impacts of that loss of trust, where there's a breakdown in communication, where those partnerships are not really strengthened in that way, and that loss of trust not only affects what might happen, it'll affect people's decisions making in the future, whether they invest. Investing in these supply chains costs a lot of money, and already things are difficult in some areas. And so if those type of discussions, and they're uninformed, even if they're uninformed, it will influence concern and investment decisions, both from the private sector, which are critical to these markets, but also the government. And as we've seen in Vietnam, governments and private sector adapt quickly. They look for alternative markets. We've already had one boatload of Brazilian cattle into Vietnam when conditions were slightly different, but then looking for other sources of animals and livestock, cattle in the region. So we can't just think that we can even think about these things lightly, because even just doing that has kind of fairly significant impacts. So it's an area very, very cautiously proceed.
Yeah. Well, of course, we heard the Minister earlier, unequivocally say that he was completely supportive of the live cattle trade. And all we know in terms of the sheep trade is that some decision will be made in the next term of government. So we will take it that we still have both the sheep and cattle trade continuing to thrive. So I want to turn to opportunities now. For the Middle East, Dr. Faris and Amanda, where do you see the opportunities for Australian livestock and live exports? Is it in terms of, how do we increase our markets? What are the things we need to do differently? And where will those opportunities lie in the longer term?
Yeah, now Saudi Arabia, they have import from many countries, especially from Africa and also Romania. Now we come to Australia here to import the sheep from Australia to Saudi Arabia, but we need to follow some rules like SCAS. Now everything is good because we see the sheep here is high quality, and also the breed high healthy. It's very, very good for our market in Saudi Arabia. That we are focusing for the sheep here from Australia. Yeah, that's all.
And Amanda, in the region more broadly?
Yeah, look, I think you know, the opportunity is growing. The market in the Middle East, meat is a really important part of the culture. Some countries, they eat meat for breakfast, lunch and dinner. You know, if it's not meat, it's offal sandwiches or something. So, you know, it's quite a big part of their diet. And I think the recognition as well of the nutritional value, the understanding that countries like Australia can offer a really safe product as well is well recognised. So I think the opportunity is there, and I think that you know, as an industry, and we need to be very clear about how we interact and want to interact with international trading partners to get their confidence and keep that trade sustainable.
And Rod, where do you see the opportunities in Vietnam?
In opportunities, I see two broad categories of opportunities. One is on the partnerships and collaboration. Strengthening and continuing to improve the collaboration between government, the industry, private sector, with our Vietnamese counterparts, government. Understanding the context and situation that they're in, which is challenging, understanding that they have alternatives, and strengthening that collaborative partnership. Australia not only has a reputation for excellent product, it has a reputation for excellent technical expertise that we can support. And we have to think broader than just selling livestock or beef to Vietnam as a country. We have to understand the situation that they're facing, and whether it's in their breeding, improving their breeding herd productivity, improving the genetics, improving feed efficiency, improving animal welfare standards. I think there's lots of areas, and it's about joining up some of the activities that are already happening. And many times things are happening within the Department of Foreign Affairs, within ACR, within MLA, and it needs to be joined up to develop a more Team Australia approach with our Vietnamese counterparts. There's a range of technical opportunities as well in investment, particularly around trying to improve competitiveness and value adding in the current trade. And importers and feedlotters need to extract more value and margin out of the current trade. And that could be post-processed in terms of value adding, but also feedlot efficiency, but also looking at diversification of cattle types and classes, whether it's feeder cattle, even thinking around breeder types or females, and genetics. So I think there's a lot to do. It's a challenging environment, but to go forward, it's around technical innovation and investment, but also that collaborative partnerships.
Yeah, you make a really good point in terms of tapping into the smarts here in Australia and how we can share that. And, you know, your comments around collaboration and joined up really resonate with me, particularly given the different roles I have. Neny, opportunities in Indonesia, where do you see, you know, the real opportunities are?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, 1/3 of the red meat need will need to be filled by importation, and then Kurban Festival cannot be replaced with the frozen or chilled meat. And the last opportunities that I can think about is cattle farm integration. I think it's become a trending topic in Indonesia. It's been become a formal organization called Gapensiska in Indonesia, and I think Australia is known as the best breeder supplier. So it will be a good opportunities, but we have to understand that cattle farm integration will be managed by local farmers. That means minimal infrastructure, minimal knowledge and skills. So we have to work together to provide the support for that. I think that's the opportunities.
And really key opportunities there. Now, I think we do have time for questions. So, yes, we've got a question over here.
Thank you. Great presentations. I just wanted to find out, Andrew Dolchan here, sorry. When we look at the French thing you mentioned about, you know, doing the hedges and they're getting paid for doing that, I guess they see that as an environmental thing that they're imposing on other people to come in. our SCAS could be seen in the same light from an animal welfare perspective. How do we reconcile those two things and still not be duplicit in our expectations, I guess?
All right, I'll take that one. I think we've got to be really careful, and we've got to be quite frank when I talked about non-tariff barriers, that Australia does get accused of putting in some of the non-tariff barriers ourselves, and quite often it will be around biosecurity. Now, we've heard a lot about biosecurity this morning, and we maintain there's an island. We have to really protect our borders and make sure that we can protect from anything coming in. By the same token, when I'm in overseas markets, and when I was in South America, I certainly got lobbied about dulce de leche, and how that should be allowed to come into Australia. So you're quite right, we do need to look at that, but I think the important thing is that we have standards, and those standards are actually recognised in other countries. It's not just something that's only being put on by ourselves. Now, you could argue that the EU as a bloc is actually looking at putting in certain standards themselves, but even within the EU, they're finding this a bit challenging. So we've seen agitation from the Netherlands, from Ireland, and even within Germany. And I always say that when it comes to regulation, you've got to actually make it something you can comply with, otherwise you won't get compliance. So what's the outcome we want? And we need to really think about that. It is challenging, and I think we've got to actually make sure, and part of this comes down to negotiation, but what we don't want is trade-offs that are not the best for the industry simply to try and get to the end result of an agreement. We've actually got to think about what's best in terms of the outcomes.
I guess just a quick follow-up to that is, I think from a consumer's perspective, and that's just multiple consumers around the world in lots of different aspects, and at the end of the day, we sort of spend a lot of time thinking about getting them in to come to us, but if they eat, they're part of agriculture. I think they're already in the club unless they opt out, and I think if we change that perspective of communicating with them, that they are already part of this big wheel of work that goes on to provide them with food, then I think that they've got to disengage basically. So getting them back on and us be listening to them might be a different approach.
And I think that goes partly to a question I had earlier around how do you actually, what's the communication mechanism? And there's people smarter than me that, will work on that. But I think you're right, you've actually got to be getting to the broader consumer, not just the one that already, knows that they're supportive of agriculture. Now, I'm a bit blinded here, but I'm looking for hands. I think they can hear afternoon tea, Don. That's what it is.
I think you've exhausted them, Sue, but sorry, the one in front. No?
Sue, one for you. Do you consider that some Middle Eastern markets desire and preference for wet meat in their wet markets, live animals rather than box meat is an ideological position, or is that based on science?
It's actually based on the reality of what happens in those countries, and it's not just over in the Middle East, and you heard that from Rod and Neny. Neny didn't actually refer directly to wet markets, but I've seen them over in Indonesia. It's very much a cultural thing, and we've got to have respect for that, and we've got trust in terms of how we actually provide, and it's been the way that we've had the supply to these countries for so long. In those countries, and look, I'm probably not best placed to respond to this, so I will refer to others on the panel, but the practicalities of having to go to box beef in terms of storage, how they can receive it, but just what they think that they're going to be, are they being told by another country what they should be eating, actually can make the difference. Panel, happy for you to talk further on that in terms of wet markets versus boxed.
I like the question. Certainly, the majority in Vietnam of meat is consumed, as you said, as hot meat, and it's a cultural decision, as Sue said. It's a cultural practice that we know well. However, consumption patterns are changing slowly, and traditional markets will continue to be very important for many years yet. But recent MLA research is showing that everyday consumers are purchasing meat and beef through different channels, sometimes at the wet market, sometimes through the supermarket, sometimes through convenience stores or even home delivery. And that, I think, has accelerated over COVID, but will continue to change. But it's not just going to that cultural daily shopping, the interaction with buyers and sellers at the market is not going to change anytime soon, certainly within Vietnam and that culture. And that's going to be part of the thing to stay.